The meaning of African philosophy itself. Um, let's break it down to the two concepts, which would, in a sense, start answering your question, African and philosophy. In what senses can we use the concept of Africa itself? I think there are two key senses. We can simply speak of Africa in the more geographical sense, as a geographical place. Again, bringing us back to the idea of the geography of reason. So reason, thinking, or philosophizing emerging from the space we would call Africa. But of course, this would be quite narrow because it would not cover the much more broader connections that we would have in mind when we think about African philosophy. So in the broader sense, we'll be thinking about the experiences, the thoughts, the memories, so beyond geography, and the meaning making of African and African diasporic people. So it will go beyond just the sort of philosophical thought that exists within an African place. It would obviously also include myself, for example, in a Western space, philosophizing about Africa, because there's already that shared experience, there's already the memory, there's already the collective meaning making with other Africans, and therefore African philosophy, the African within African philosophy will go beyond just the geographical place called Africa to include African diasporic places where African philosophy is still thought about and still practiced in a sense. So it would mean acknowledging the geography of reason as a place, but also as an experience. So place here would not mean just the physical place, but also mean the shared thoughts, the shared experiences, memory, and so on. And so this would be a much more comprehensive sense of using the word African within African philosophy. But some would say, would it not be then safer to say philosophies rather than philosophy? To sort of acknowledge the diversity of thought that would exist in such a large space, why not use philosophies? Why use philosophy? The argument would be that the danger of using philosophy would sort of homogenize the diverse philosophical system of African peoples, and it would narrow it down to a very sort of, it would narrow down a very broad spectrum of discourse. So for example, when we think about personhood in African philosophy, something we will discuss in due course, you would find different conceptions. So among the Akan people of Ghana, for example, you will find what Kwasi Wiredu and Kwame Gyekye would describe as either as a tripartite conception or pentachomistic conception. So either having 3 ontological features or 5 ontological features. Among the Yorubas, you find 3 ontological features, or some would argue for a dualistic conception. So there are varieties or diversities within African places, right? And the question would be, would the use of philosophy not narrow down or essentialize the diversity within African philosophical places? Well, of course, the quick and easy response would be, we would not, for example, say Chinese philosophies or Western philosophies or Indian philosophies, we'll still use the singular because philosophy there is simply to acknowledge the geography of reason. It's not to say that there's a homogeneity of thought. I mean, Western philosophy is extremely diverse, radically different. You find 2, 3, 4, 5 philosophers not agreeing on anything, but it's still Western philosophy. Chinese philosophy or Asian philosophy has all sorts of traditions, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on and so forth. But the Chinese philosophy, it's simply a recognition of where the reasoning or thinking or philosophizing is coming from. It's not claiming that it is one and the same thing. And of course, the danger of using philosophies in the plural sense would be that it could, in a sense, downplay on the shared experiences and similarities in thought across African places. So, for example, we speak often about Afro-communitarianism, or the idea that Ubuntu, which is now the popular concept for the relationality and solidarity of thought among African people, is something experienced across African spaces, with West Africa, East Africa, and so on and so forth. That similarity, not sameness, but similarity, that shared ways of being could be played down on when we overemphasize the plural, right? Also, the shared experience itself of this geography of reason, particularly the colonial, post-colonial experience, can also be played down on, which is the basis on which we can, for example, develop a Pan-African thought, for example. So it seems, at least to me, that African philosophy works nicely to this extent, rather than African philosophies. And of course, there are very specific contexts where you would want to clearly state philosophies rather than philosophy. So I'm currently writing an article, which I need to finish this week. I don't know how that will work out, on the non-human in African metaphysics. And I find myself at some point using philosophies, particularly when I'm trying to distinguish between, say, Igbo and Yoruba concept of the non-human. So there are contexts where you can't help it, but I think in referring to the geography of reason, African philosophy makes sense to use, to stick to, just to show that this philosophizing is happening within an African place, whatever that philosophizing may be, generally.